let's see how we go. So a big welcome to you, Anab. And the ideas we're going to try and discuss in this session will try and be a little bit of a counterflow to some of the things that we've been hearing throughout the day. And Anab, you started life really training as a designer in India, National India Design Institute, and then came to the UK and joined the RCA and Royal College of Art. Most of you will know our sister institution next door to Imperial in Exhibition Road, and we do a lot together. And we're delighted that you've been able to spare time to come and talk with us, because you've taken ideas from interaction design into a company, Superflux, and it's really some insights from the work that this business does that I think we all want to hear about. And just to set this up, Mark Girolami this morning quoted from Lord Kelvin a really great nuggety quote: "To measure is to know." Okay, and you know, there's a sort of comfort in the room. Particularly, I'm an engineer, and I know lots of engineers in the room and scientists in the room. That's what we like, isn't it? And you know, we're rational, we're logical, we're evidence-based. Of course we are. We're Imperial College, and we're deterministic. We like to create the future, and we've been talking about the future. And the question in this last session is, well, what if it doesn't quite turn out the way that our logical minds think it might? And Anab, just trying to dip into your work, there's something more visceral, I think. What does that word mean? Something more to do with our feelings and emotions that also comes in. I mean, we are human still. There's some interesting work around about to be a machine, at what point humans, with all the medical help and other things that will happen to us, might start becoming more machine-like. We may get into that with you. But at the moment, I think most of us in this room are humans and sneezing because of the hay fever. And so, you know, what is the visceral side to the future? And Superflux, I looked on your website, translating future uncertainty into today's choices. So sometimes the logic can be very powerful and drive us in a direction, but we might not always see the choices, right? And you've been working just some tantalizing headlines on the website: the drone aviary, the energy future zone, the mitigation of shock project. That's interesting. So let me ask you to maybe speak for a few minutes about your work, and then we'll have a conversation, but we'll have one I think we can engage with, all of us can engage with Anab, and on the topic that you're going to raise, which I hope will add out another dimension to thinking about the future. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I've done my homework. I was asked to make some slides, so I'm going to go over there and talk through exactly what David said, show you some of our work and projects very briefly to give you a sense of the kind of work we do. I think a lot about the future. In fact, I visit the future for a living. Not just one future, but many possible futures, and we bring those futures to life, making them concrete and visceral, as David said, so that people get, I mean, you can think of us as archaeologists of the future. So over the years, my many journeys have brought back things like a new species of synthetically engineered bees, a machine that makes you rich by trading your genetic data, a lamp powered by sugar, a computer for growing food. Of course, even though you're all working very hard at trying to break the space-time barrier, I think time machines aren't here yet, and so we don't actually physically travel to different futures, but we spend a lot of time thinking and creating visions of different futures. Like a lot of futurists and trend and foresight consultants, we are constantly listening for weak signals, those murmurs of future potential. And then we trace those threads of potential into the future, asking questions like, what might it be like to live in this future? What might we see, hear, and even breathe? But unlike other futurists or trend consultants, we don't stop there. In an almost skunkworks fashion, we start running experiments, building prototypes, making aspects of those futures concrete and visceral, so everyone has a chance to step into those worlds and experience the potential as well as the unintended consequences of living in those worlds. So, as David said, I'm going to talk through a couple of projects very briefly. So, drone aviary was one project we did a few years ago, and the idea was to understand what might it mean like, what might it feel like to live with civilian drones in our cities. Drones that have the power to see things we can't and to go places we can't, and to do so with increasing autonomy. And so to understand this technology, getting our hands dirty was crucial. We are not scientists, we're not technologists, but we collaborate a lot with scientists and technologists. And we started building many different drones in our studio. We gave them names, functions, and then flew them, but not without difficulty. These drones defy gravity. Things came loose, GPS signals glitched, a lot of us got bruised as the drones crashed. But it was through such experimentation that we were able to create one very concrete, very experiential slice of one possible future. So let's go to that future. Let's imagine we are living in a city with drones like this one. It patrols the streets, often spotted in the evenings and at nights. Initially, many of us were annoyed by its low, dull hum. But like everything else, we got used to it. We call it the night watchman. Now, what if we could see the world through its eyes? See how it constantly logs every resident of the neighborhood, logging the kids who play football in the no-ball game area, and marking them as statutory nuisances. And then see how it disperses this other group of who are teenagers with the threat of an autonomously issued injunction. And then there's this giant floating disk called Madison. Its glaring presence is so overpowering, I can't help but stare at it. But it feels like each time I look at it, it knows a little more about me. Like it keeps flashing all these Brian Air adverts at me, as if it knows about the holiday I'm planning. I'm not sure if I find this mildly entertaining or just entirely invasive. Okay, back to the present. Of course, drones in this particular form are not real yet, but as you all know, most elements of our drone future are in fact very real today. For example, facial recognition systems are everywhere, constantly keeping a record of everything we do, from our phones to the city cameras, logging information. Whether it's an advertisement we glanced at, or in many cases a protest we attended, these systems are here. And many of the people in the public domain, the public, do not understand how they work and what their consequences could be. And so I think what we do with our work, whether it's commissions or clients, is that we want to affect change by getting people to directly confront, very tangibly and emotionally, some of the future consequences of their actions, their decisions, their inventions, their innovations today. So briefly, to talk about a project we did with the government of the UAE, who invited us to help them shape the country's energy strategy all the way up to 2050. So based on the government's econometric data, we created 5 futures. And this large city model visualized those futures. So you could go through the interface and see what happens if there was no investment in renewables, all the way to 100% investment in renewables, which would lead to zero carbon emissions. Of course, this is UAE, and they love their cars, and they love their private transport. So I was talking to a group of the cabinet ministers and officials and members of energy companies through one sustainable future, when one of them said to me, I can't imagine that people here would really be into public transport. In fact, I can't even tell my own son to stop driving his own car. But we were prepared for this reaction. Working with scientists in a chemistry lab in my home city, Ahmedabad in India, we had created approximate samples of what the air would be like in 2030 if our behavior stays the same. And so I walked the group over to this object that emits vapor from those samples. Just one whiff of the noxious polluted air brought home the point that no amount of data could, because they had a lot of data and they could have invested in renewables a long time ago. This is not the air you would allow your children to breathe. the government went through the process and made a big announcement to invest. They went for the fourth scenario, so just short of 100% investment in renewables. I think that our future experiences probably did play a small role in this decision, and in this decision to mitigate, they've changed their energy policy to mitigate some of the worst case scenarios. And so what we do in our work essentially to kind of to tell organizations is that it's better to be surprised by simulation than blindsided by reality. For instance, data like this is a graph by NASA about climate change. But very often when we talk to people, this graph doesn't mean anything. What does it mean in our daily lives? Climate change, food shortages. We wanted to look inside this graph. I was in Mumbai at the very time we were studying the graph, experiencing some of the worst effects of infrastructure breakdown and emotional turmoil because of heavy flooding. And so we explored one possible future around climate change, where the Western world has moved from abundance to scarcity. We imagined living in a future city with repeated flooding, broken supply chains, economic instabilities, and periods with almost no food in supermarkets. The question was, what can ordinary people do to survive, and not just survive, but actually prosper in such a future? What food can we eat? And so, to really get inside these questions, we started building food computers using the technique of fogponics. So just nutrient fog, no water or soil, to help things grow quicker and indoors when there is real uncertainty around the weather outside. And we built them using the cheapest and the most accessible materials, essentially turning today's waste into tomorrow's dinner. And so I'm going to take you through this installation that we created. We didn't just create the food computers and show it to people. We created an apartment, a domestic space that people can recognize and feel familiar with to understand what it might mean to live in a future with such scarcity. So this is when the visitors enter. This is an installation in the Center for the Cultural Center in Barcelona, around 2050 or so, when my son is around our age. At first glance, a seemingly comfortable living space designed for a world of automated living, global trade, and material abundance. But then, a realization that the apartment has been adapted to a world it was never meant to inhabit. Discarded newspapers, a radio show, reflect the tensions of this new world. A smart panel constantly asking the fridge to refill milk, but where is the milk to be refilled? Recipes in the kitchen reflect the change in food production and consumption.
Police are continuing to investigate how a cyber attack by eco-terrorists.
Experimental food production now occupies the space once given to relaxation, transforming the apartment into a space for growing and producing food. Resourcefully hacked together consumer items, IKEA shelves, decorative fog makers, computer fans, programmable microcontrollers, plumbing supplies, and LEDs. Fog oozing out of these contraptions, blinding purple light. Mushrooms and mycelium growing around them. We also tried to grow, to do algae and spirulina. And then looking beyond, you see that there lies a city, familiar yet alien. And so the idea of this work and all the work we do is not to say predict a future, saying this is going to be the future. But what it helped do is 100,000 people experienced this apartment over the period of 4 months. All of them spent long amounts of time in it. All of them had a chance to reflect and to understand that this could be one possible future, but to also recognize that we have the tools ready and available today for a different lifestyle and become more responsible for the consequences. So I think, and we're also kind of making some of our recipes online and open source. I'm going to leave with this slide because I think this is what I want to talk about. Like, our work is about helping understand how we can be more responsible for any possible future and for preparing for contingencies. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like to come back?
Yeah, we'll come back.
Yeah. Let me ask you, thank you, it's a lovely, vivid presentation of some of your work. Let me start off by asking you about the role of design, because I think I get a sense that, and it's an enticing title, the Interaction Design, the course that you studied at the RCA, that there's something very real about trying to put ideas together here to demonstrate. And how do you see that function in helping us understand futures?
I think it's one of the big parts, one of the big things that design does is help people place themselves within an abstract, which would feel like an abstract future. So many times, whether it's high-level CEOs of organizations whom we work with or general public, they don't have the time or the resource to actually step inside these futures. So our kind of design is about bringing, is working really with the material of time and making that kind of tangible and concrete. But I would arguably say that design is everywhere, you know, whether you talk about biology or whether you talk about designing cities, or whether you talk about, today design is much more than just something that you decorate or put over. Yeah.
And I think that's important, and particularly for we know at Imperial College with our Dyson Design School and working with the RCA, how enriched we are these days by having more work together with design thinking and designers. It also seems that your work is taking the experiment out of the lab and into the street. So you're almost prototyping in the wild to try and understand what the future looks like.
Yeah.
And that must be a conscious decision, right? To take that experimentation there and see what people, you know, however many thousand people you said come into that apartment and get feedback.
Yeah, I think that's really important because we started off with looking at technology, with interaction design. We were really understanding the implications and potential around emerging technologies. And what we found is that in the lab, like creators and then marketeers can only ever suggest certain use cases. And technology's true potential is always realized by the user. So that's something that we found, that, you know, and when you market it, you are marketing it with the ideals that you would like the technology to be used in. But we found that the technology was, whether it's knitting groups or fascist regimes, that same technology was used in very different ways. And that's why it's really important to be able to test and try and understand. You can't cover all ground, but to really understand how people might use this technology, for instance, is really critical.
And very different settings from Barcelona to Mumbai.
Yes.
And presumably that gives you a lot of stimulation in terms of how people respond.
Yes, absolutely. Like, you know, there was a huge surprise around the Syrian refugees using smartphones, and it was all over the press, you know. But Syria was a really prosperous country. Damascus was hugely prosperous. Why are we surprised that people there had smartphones? Like, you know, it's really interesting how there is a certain use case, and we think of a very, quite often, a Californian view of technology.
I mean, you've made a business out of it. I think, thinking about Imperial College and my colleagues, I see many of our scientists and engineers and medics breaking out of the lab, some of them quite a long time ago, and you know, experimenting in the street or working with companies out in their places. Yeah. And this does seem to be a very good way of embracing the future. As you said, you visit the future for a living. Sometimes you have to get out of where you are at the moment, and your work inspires that, right? And how do you help other people to think like that? Is that?
Yeah, we work across, like I was telling you, we work across different kinds of sectors, and what we find is that quite often people are scared of investing in one future, let alone multiple futures. And that's because there is a kind of, as you said, a deterministic view moving, but that is breaking so often. So we are seeing examples of how Kodak was a good example, went along this linear route, whilst we're seeing companies like IKEA or Amazon have very strong, very agile futures team who are able to look long term as well as short term, and that's really critical.
Let me pursue another aspect of your work. I mean, there's certainly in the clips you've shown us, there's quite a dark side. There's a dystopian future coming through, and we've had some pretty cheerful, upbeat presentations today about, we're engineers, we'll create the future, and I'm sure actually that's the way our colleagues in the room feel and should feel. But you mentioned the word unintended consequences, and in a sense, some of the things you've shown us point to that. How do you start to work that into an understanding of unintended consequences, into choices, and into thoughts about the future?
I think that's almost an question of ethics, and what are the ethics of the organization who's creating this? Because I think obviously, apart from multiple features, there's a lot to be done. That there's a kind of a science fiction-y kind of end to solve problems kind of thing. But I think a more rigorous anthropological approach, an ethnographic approach is necessary. I would say, to avoid unintended consequences, we should not try and measure performance metrics on financial success. It's because when you start doing that, the performance of the product is, you want a closure around that. And then thorny questions around what might be the unintended consequences, who might benefit, who might harm, come in the way of that trajectory of progress.
Well, the difficulty on measures of financial success often is about over what period of time are you measuring financial success. And I think, understanding equally the societal impact alongside financial success in different time periods may be a nice complement to that.
I think it's possible. I think I think organizations or big companies who are doing technology have to have the intention of really being aware of the unintended consequences. Like Google has just released their AI principles last week. And that's a good start. That's promising. I'm really curious how they'll implement it.
Yeah. Let me remind people. Some of you will have heard me tell the story of Thomas Midgley, the person who has made a greater difference to the world's atmosphere than any other living organism in history. And if you don't know it, well, this is a story of unintended consequences, because Thomas Midgley worked for GM, General Motors, in the 1920s and developed an additive to petrol to stop engine knock. And it was a lead additive, and 15 of his researchers died from lead poisoning. And that wasn't half of it. He got very sick. But the company found that it worked. And so lead was then added to petrol. And for many years, the fumes in the street were dulling the minds, particularly of our children, and killing people. And we had to ban, in the end, the use of lead in petrol. And he didn't stop there. He of course, didn't intend to kill people. That wasn't his goal in life. He moved on to frigid air. And at the time, in the 1930s, the refrigerant was highly explosive, and it wasn't a good idea to keep it in a refrigerator in someone's home. So he invented Freon, and it unleashed the whole white goods refrigeration industry. And of course, it was CFCs, and that blew a hole in the ozone layer. And so in 2 decades, one great genius innovator had massive unintended consequences for the Earth planet. And I think there's a salutary tale there about how we think about 2038 with some of the technologies we've seen. What damage could they do? Just to round out on our hapless Thomas Midgley, he caught polio, poor chap, in 1950. And in his mid-50s, was so fed up with being helped out of bed every morning, he developed a pulley system in his bedroom so he could pull himself out of bed. And he accidentally got it tangled one day and strangled himself and died. So, innovators can have unintended consequences of all types. And that's a pretty dark dystopian view of, and it's a true one, of what happens. But I think when we're building these futures and thinking about our choices, some of us, if not all of us, should have some thought to that side. And your work dramatically shows that. I mean, that poor chap sniffing the fumes of exhaust from 2050, right?
30, yeah. But it's approximate. You can never really get a very clear data around the future of air pollution. But it was an extrapolation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe you go to Calcutta or Delhi or somewhere and take a sample of the
We could just from there, that would have been enough, actually.
And it made a difference?
It made a difference is what they say. It's hard to say. It's because, I mean, the Prime Minister walked through it and he has no time. And so I think that played a role as well. He doesn't have time to go through the data. It does not mean others, but in that kind of a setup, he makes the decision, he makes the call. So that kind of pushed him.
Let me ask you about that then. What role does leadership have in your work?
Yeah.
You're giving very vivid illustrations here of choices and playing with technology in social spaces, which is, you know, where much of our work in our companies and places like Imperial College will eventually have to come out to play. How do you get leaders to think? You've given us a couple of examples. That's an important part of this.
I mean, I think all leaders need to be futurists, to be honest, or not in a way that they understand trends, but to actually, because being a leader in today's time is really challenging, and that's the conversations we have all the time. There's so much increased ambiguity to say that, okay, I'm only going to do better measurement, I'm only going to have better project management methods. It's not going to be enough anymore. I think all leaders need to be, to have a bigger sense, the bigger view of what's going on, to be able to constantly ask more questions, to be, you know, to be able to understand how things are changing, and to be able to have the foresight and the agility to be able to pivot and move. It's kind of an important skill today.
But isn't there something psychological about this, that we want certainty, right? I mean, the whole of this morning was about uncertainty, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns.
Unknown unknowns, my favorite.
And, you know, but we all, in a different part of our lives, want something that we feel secure about. And that means we need decisions to be made. Whereas choices mean keeping options open and maybe offsetting the day when you make a decision, and just to see how it plays out and have more experimentation. How do you bridge that gap between, you know, that rather human need for security and certainty, and playing with options, right? Playing with choices.
It's a bit like playing the game of pool. You know, you're constantly, at every point there is a bifurcation, and there is a kind of many options are open. I think there's general sense we get from organizations we work with that having many options is expensive, whereas one option is clear, certain, but case by case is showing increasingly that kind of linear method is not going to work.
We got some questions here from people.
Wow.
Should we have a look at some of these?
Yeah.
What balance must we strike between data and imagination to look into the future? Oof. Do you want to have a go at that?
I think, like I was just telling you earlier, that the method that we use is not against the scientific deterministic data method, but it's complementary. So I don't think there is like a number, but as long as both methods are used together.
Yeah. And look at Ben's question here. How can we combat nostalgia for the status quo, or the past, I guess?
Yeah.
And antipathy, it keeps jumping around, or even vehemence towards advancement. Well, you know, we're in that world at the moment, aren't we? There's a lot of people want to look back in time in some senses, and are worried about where we're going to. So
I mean, I feel like everyone I talk to, there's no utopia. We somehow really are missing a utopic politics. We're missing, I think people I think this is a real good time to give people utopian visions that are actually plausible and are just and are sustainable. And
some vision as well, and some hope. Yeah. Do you put hope in your work?
Hope, yeah. There's a word that Kim Stanley Robinson coined called angry optimism, and I think I'm an angry optimist. In a sense, I'm very hopeful. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing the work I do.
Right.
But we can't just say I want the world to be a peaceful place. That's not enough. That's a nice idea, but how do you action it?
Yeah.
You need to start placing beacons along the way to be able to move towards that.
Yeah, I'm thinking actually while we're talking and seeing questions come up in this moment when the Grenfell Tower is being remembered, you know, and today with the minute silence, how that's such a desperate situation, and it's almost difficult to think that people will have to be blamed for that because there's some systemic failure and societal failure, but we need to work it out. I mean, presumably your work has something to say about those rather tragic situations in terms of how do we deal with options and think about where technology is used and deployed, and tremendous unintended consequences, I'm sure, around.
Yeah, but
design,
I think that particular thing is very tragic, but that was really, it feels like shunning responsibility,
Right.
and it's really not, it comes down to really cutting corners, and so it's almost too straightforward.
Poor practices.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Wow.
What
Nobody's
skills
ever
should we
asked me so many good questions.
Let's go for this one. What skills should we be teaching young people now for long-term future? We can get you some of these questions.
Oh,
don't
good.
worry. for teaching young people, how do we get young people to think?
That's a really good question.
more like this, right? And to be more flexible in their thinking and playful, perhaps.
I think that's really good, because I think education has a big role to play, and we're talking to a couple of educators, and I think actually this kind of desire for certainty starts because we are, as a society, we are averse to asking questions. We always want solutions and answers. And as a child, when you start going to school, you start getting measured. And what are the two ways you can get measured? My son started school, so English and maths. But he's probably got other kinds of intelligence that is not easy to measure, so he's not intelligent. And he asks too many questions. That's being willful, or that's being, so he should answer the questions he's being asked. So we are already putting ourselves from very young age into this frame of solutionism and determinism and certainty, which has worked for us so far, but I don't think it's going to work for us much longer. I think we need to think a bit broader.
More adaptive.
Yeah, so more cross-disciplinary, more creative, more thinking around resilience, building more resilient skills. There's so many things we can do. Yeah, it's really...
And so does that mean you would shy away from trying to answer the question about technologies you're expecting for 2038?
No, I love technology.
So go on. What are your hot tips for what's going to happen?
I don't know, but you were just telling me about 4D printing.
Well, that was these guys.
Meaning I know about 4D printing, but the use case around the airplane thing would be amazing. And then obviously the thing, I think anything that will help us combat antibiotic resistance.
Yeah.
There is renewables, climate change related technologies. I'm hugely nuclear fission, maybe. It's like fusion.
Fusion, yeah.
Fusion.
Well, I mean, those could all be in the next 20 years, something that...
Quantum computing?
Quantum computing, yeah, we got some expertise in the room on that. Do you know, I mean, some of those things are absolutely, we have to target and go after. The antimicrobial resistance one, for example, the air pollution one, or we're all going to be sounding like me.
Do you think the air pollution has got to do more with technology or with political will?
Both.
Yeah.
It has to be both, doesn't it? Yeah. We have to have the means of providing a cleaner environment where we can still be mobile, go about our work and lives, and there's a technological aspect.
Actually, technology that could eliminate hay fever would be great. Pollen. Synthetic biology.
It's called a mask.
Where you edit the micro.
Yes.
Where you edit the
Genes.
the plants to not produce this kind of pollen.
Yeah, well, just because we're going to wrap up now, Anna, but let me just ask you on that one, because it's a tease, isn't it? I can get it with the sort of more mechatronic things and doing your drone aviary and your experiment in the wild with that. But at what point is your Superflux firm going to start editing genes and do experiments in the wild with synthetic biology type?
I mean, it's already happening, isn't it? It's just unlike digital systems, natural systems are more capricious, and hence we cannot assume the mutations that will happen. But that's really fascinating space to talk to synthetic biology. We have worked with synthetic biologists, and we worked with genomics and editing microorganisms. So it shouldn't be ignored.
Yeah. I'm just going to, just on the closing point, the last question's caught my eye. Nick's utopian future shaping companies, Facebook, Tesla, recently have had major wake-up calls. Are we at an interesting tipping point, forcing them to face reality? Well, I mean, one translation of that is, do we think about the failure modes, right?
Yeah.
What are the things that can go wrong for these business models and these types of companies?
Yeah.
Are we at a tipping point? Are some of these larger-than-life entrepreneurs and companies going to have to rethink?
I mean, they should. I think that's where the unintended consequences thing and the whole ethics thing came up. That yes, if you don't do it already, you would be forced to doing it.
Yep.
But at the same time, this other side of me is like, I know some people within my filter bubble have stopped using Facebook, but how many people have actually stopped using Facebook? I don't know.
You've given us a wonderful little window into another world of futures and ways of thinking, and actually a very playful way of experiencing futures and bringing them into the present. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Hope you'll come and talk with us again sometime, and maybe we'll do some projects with, or you'll do some projects with some of the companies or some of our students and people.
Thank you.
And certainly your Superflux business should be able to grow, because you need to go and work for Facebook and Tesla and all those people, because they need this stuff. So good luck.
Thank you
very much.
Thank
and let's
you.
give Anab a round of applause.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.